Alright, here it goes. This isn't something I ever thought I'd be putting into words, but maybe getting it out will help me make sense of everything. I've been married to Emily for 12 years. She was my best friend, my partner, the love of my life. We were that couple. The one our friends joked about for never fighting, for still looking at each other like we were teenagers. I thought our marriage was rock solid, untouchable. It all started just last month, when Emily had to get her wisdom teeth taken out. Routine, right? She was a little nervous about the sedation, so I offered to take her to and from the appointment. I figured it was the least I could do to help her feel comfortable. Little did I know that this simple trip to the dentist would change everything. I got to the office just as she was coming out of the procedure, still groggy and half asleep. Her eyes were unfocused, her words slurred, and at first, I thought it was just amusing. People always say funny things when they're coming off anesthesia. She was mumbling, saying random things that didn't make much sense, so I chuckled a bit and held her hand, ready to take her home. But then she looked right at me, her eyes all glassy and dazed, and said something that turned my stomach. She began to apologize, her voice soft and tinged with regret, murmuring that she had messed up. The words were quiet and hard to catch, but there was a strange, almost childlike quality to her voice that made my skin crawl. She seemed to be confessing to something that she hadn't been able to stop once it started. There was a weight to her tone, a guilty, remorseful edge that didn't fit with the typical nonsense of coming off anesthesia. At first, I wanted to brush it off. I told myself she was just loopy, that she'd laugh it off when she came to her senses. But the more she spoke, the more the cold dread in my stomach grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something real behind her words, that they weren't just random, drug-induced mumblings. She spoke about someone else, hinting at a connection that hadn't meant anything to her. As I drove her home in silence, I was numb. It felt like I was in some strange dream where nothing made sense, yet everything felt all too real. My mind was racing, filled with questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. Part of me wanted to believe I'd misheard, that it was just the anesthesia talking. But deep down, I couldn't shake the gut-wrenching feeling that I'd just witnessed a crack in the foundation of my marriage. Once we got home, I got her settled in bed. My plan was to give her time to sleep it off, hoping that whatever I'd heard was nothing but nonsense. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching her drift off, every minute feeling like an hour. Eventually, she woke up and looked at me with a sleepy smile, thanking me for taking care of her, as if nothing had happened at all. In that moment, I felt an unsettling calm wash over me. That night, I lay beside her in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Her words kept circling in my mind, replaying over and over like a broken record. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that strange, dazed confession. The guilt, the regret, the way she'd called whatever happened a mistake. It was like everything I knew about my marriage, my wife, and the life we'd built was suddenly uncertain. As the days passed, I tried to push it out of my mind, convincing myself that maybe I had misheard, that her words had been nonsense, a product of the drugs. But deep down, that seed of doubt had taken root. Every little thing started feeling suspicious. Her laughter over the phone, the way she'd stay up late texting a friend she'd never mentioned before, the evenings she came home later than usual. Things that had never bothered me before now felt loaded with hidden meaning. The uncertainty started eating away at me, twisting my mind into knots. I'd catch myself looking at her from across the room, wondering if there was something in her expression that I hadn't noticed before. Sometimes I'd find myself wanting to ask her outright about that day, about the mistake she'd mentioned, but then I'd remind myself that, without proof, it could all backfire. I couldn't risk her brushing it off and making me feel like I was losing my mind. So, instead, I waited. In the middle of all this, I started to notice strange patterns. Financially, things weren't adding up. Little charges on our bank statements appeared here and there, unexplained dinners, gas stations clear across town, boutique charges she never brought home in shopping bags. I told myself there had to be a logical reason, but each time I tried to bring it up casually, she'd brush it off with vague answers, calling them work expenses or gifts for friends. Then, one evening, I saw an opportunity. She'd left her phone out on the kitchen counter, something she never used to be so careless about. My hands started shaking, but I told myself that I wasn't snooping. I was simply confirming or dismissing the growing suspicions I couldn't shake. What I found on her phone made my heart drop. A series of messages with someone saved under an innocuous name, Kim. But the way they wrote to each other was anything but innocent. This wasn't a friend, and it definitely wasn't her colleague Kim. They spoke in code, planning secret meetups, sharing inside jokes, discussing details in a way that felt like it had been going on for a while. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I scrolled through, every message confirming what I'd been dreading. I put the phone down, careful to leave it exactly as I'd found it, then went outside to clear my head. The whole time, I was just repeating to myself that I'd been wrong to look, that I'd opened up something I couldn't close now. But now I knew. There was no brushing it aside. After that night, everything changed. I couldn't unsee those messages or pretend that they were anything other than what they were. She was hiding something, someone, and the reality of that hit me like a train. Suddenly, all those little moments that I'd once ignored came flooding back with a new, brutal clarity. The late nights, the way she'd sometimes step outside to take a call, the random work dinners she never used to have. It all seemed so obvious now, like I'd been walking around with blinders on. I felt torn. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers. But I knew that without solid evidence, she could just deny everything. She might even turn it around on me, accuse me of being paranoid, or worse, try to gaslight me into doubting my own instincts. I couldn't let that happen. I needed proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof that she couldn't brush off or explain away. So I started keeping track, meticulously noting every inconsistency, every time her story didn't quite line up. I went back through our bank statements, scrolling through every single charge and noting anything that seemed out of place. I'd never realized how many small, seemingly insignificant purchases she'd made without ever mentioning them. Boutique hotel charges, high-end restaurants I'd never heard of, all expenses that just didn't make sense given her usual habits. A few days later, I decided to go one step further. I downloaded a location tracking app onto her phone, one that could give me a detailed report of where she went, day by day. It felt wrong, invasive, even, but the doubt gnawing at me was stronger than any guilt I felt. I knew I couldn't live with myself if I let this slide without knowing the truth. The first few days, there was nothing unusual. She'd go to work, to her yoga class, to her sister's house, places she'd always gone. For a while, I wondered if I'd gone too far, that maybe she really was just working late, or maybe I'd been making something out of nothing. But on the fourth day, a notification came in from the app that caught my attention immediately. Instead of her usual route home, she'd gone to a different neighborhood on the other side of town. An area where we didn't know anyone, and certainly not somewhere she'd ever mentioned needing to go. I watched as the little tracking dot stopped in front of a small, upscale hotel. She stayed there for nearly 2 hours. Then, just as quickly, the dot showed her heading back across town toward home. That night, as she walked in the door, I played it cool, pretending I didn't notice she was a little later than usual. But deep down, I felt sick. I knew now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there was someone else. That night, after Emily fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the wall, replaying everything I'd seen, every moment of the last few weeks, in my mind. There it was, undeniable. My wife had gone to a hotel, stayed there for hours, and then come home, acting like nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the image of her meeting someone else, lying to my face every day, slipping into our bed as if nothing was wrong. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. Confronting her without enough proof meant risking her spinning some excuse, brushing it off as a one-time mistake, or some other excuse I wasn't ready to hear. I needed more. I needed a way to make sure she couldn't escape the truth. So, the next morning, I called an attorney. I'd never imagined I'd be talking to a divorce lawyer, but I knew I needed advice. If what I suspected was true, I wanted to understand my options, to make sure I didn't get blindsided. The attorney explained that to build a case based on infidelity, I'd need documented proof. I felt a mix of relief and dread, knowing that gathering that proof would mean sinking even deeper into the whole situation. With the lawyer's advice in mind, I decided to hire a private investigator. It felt surreal, like something from a movie. I'd never expected to find myself secretly paying someone to watch my own wife. But I knew this was the only way to get real answers, to see past whatever lies she was weaving to keep me in the dark. For the next 2 weeks, I carried on like nothing was wrong. I went to work, came home, ate dinner, even smiled when she'd tell me stories about her day, all the while knowing that I was uncovering every move she made. I'd check in with the investigator every few days, getting updates on where she'd gone, who she'd been with, and I learned to keep my expression blank, to keep up the appearance of a trusting, unsuspecting husband. Then, one day, the investigator called with news. Emily had met the same man multiple times, once at a restaurant across town and again at that same hotel. This time, he'd gotten photos. Photos of them entering the hotel together, her face unmistakable, her hand in his. Seeing the images made my stomach turn, but it was also strangely clarifying. There it was, in black and white. All the proof I needed. With the evidence in hand, I knew I was getting closer to the end of this. Once I had those photos, everything changed. The doubts and denial I'd been clinging to were gone. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding. My wife was seeing another man, sneaking off to hotels, living a life I hadn't been part of. I spent hours just sitting there, staring at the photos, feeling this strange calm set in. It wasn't sadness anymore, or even anger. Just a kind of numb determination. I knew what I had to do. My first step was meeting with the lawyer again. This time, I had the proof, and we discussed how to handle things moving forward. The lawyer walked me through the process of filing for divorce, explaining how the evidence could protect me financially, and possibly help avoid a messy battle over assets. I felt a wave of relief, knowing that I had options, that there was a way out of this that wouldn't leave me totally shattered. Over the next few days, I kept up appearances with Emily, going through our routine as if nothing had changed. But every moment I looked at her, every time she laughed or told me about her day, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. It was unsettling, like living with someone I didn't know, someone who could betray me and then act like nothing had happened. She'd kiss me goodnight, tell me she loved me, and I'd just nod, keeping my emotions locked down. I didn't trust myself to speak up yet. I needed a plan. Finally, after meeting with the lawyer a few more times and reviewing my options, I was ready to confront her. I didn't want it to be a chaotic scene. I didn't want yelling or screaming. I wanted it to be calm, undeniable, so that there would be no way for her to twist the truth. I waited until she came home from one of her yoga classes that I knew wasn't a yoga class at all. She walked in, setting her keys down with that same easy smile, that relaxed, casual air she always had. For a moment, it almost hurt to see her that way, acting like everything was fine, like she didn't have a care in the world. But this time, I didn't let myself hesitate. I pulled out the photos and placed them on the kitchen counter, one by one, until there was a line of undeniable proof between us. She froze when she saw them, and in that split second, I saw every ounce of her confidence drain away. Emily stared at the photos spread across the counter, her face going pale as the reality sank in. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. It was as if she was grappling with the sudden realization that her secret life was laid bare in front of her. For once, she didn't have the calm, collected composure I'd seen so many times before. I didn't give her the chance to speak right away. Instead, I explained exactly what I knew, how I'd noticed the changes, the hidden expenses, the late nights that didn't add up. I kept my voice even, laying out the timeline of everything I'd uncovered. Every detail, every lie, every bit of evidence I'd gathered over weeks of feeling like a stranger in my own home. I could see her flinch with each new piece of information, like each one was a nail being hammered in. Finally, she managed to speak, stumbling over her words, trying to explain that it hadn't meant anything, that it was a mistake. The same words I'd heard in that foggy, drugged confession from weeks before. She insisted it was over, that she'd only met him a few times, and that she never wanted to hurt me. But standing there, listening to her scramble to make excuses, all I felt was a hollow kind of resolve. I told her that I'd heard all I needed to hear, that the betrayal was more than I could take, and that there was no fixing it. I could see the panic building in her eyes, and she reached for my hand, saying that we could go to counseling, that she would do whatever it took. But it was too late for that. The trust was shattered, and there was no putting it back together. I could barely recognize the woman in front of me, the woman I thought I knew, who had stood by me through everything, and who I'd trusted more than anyone else. I calmly laid out the divorce papers I'd already prepared, explaining that I'd be filing them in the morning. Emily's face went blank, and I could see the shift, the desperate pleading replaced by a flash of anger. She started to blame me, claiming that I'd been distant or too focused on work. She tried to turn the whole thing around, to make it seem like her choices were somehow my fault. But the old me, the one who might have questioned himself, who might have tried to find some way to share the blame, was gone. I'd spent weeks agonizing over every detail, and I knew the truth. Her excuses, her blame-shifting, it didn't change a thing. I'd made my decision, and I wasn't backing down. I picked up the papers and left her standing there in the kitchen, her face a mix of anger, regret, and shock. As I walked out, I felt an unexpected sense of peace, a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, I filed the divorce papers. Walking into that courthouse felt surreal, like stepping into a new life I hadn't asked for but one I now knew I needed. I handed over the documents and felt the weight of everything start to lift, piece by piece. It was strange. Just a few weeks ago, I couldn't have imagined my life without Emily. Now, here I was, cutting ties with the woman I thought was my forever. After filing, I went home to start packing my things. We'd agreed to a temporary arrangement where I'd move out for a while, just until we figured out the logistics. Even though I was ready to walk away, I couldn't deny the sting of packing up my life, of putting years of memories and moments into boxes. I'd see our wedding photo on the wall or some small reminder of all the things we'd been through, and for a moment, the sadness would creep in. But I reminded myself of those photos on the counter, of the lies, of the betrayal, and my resolve would harden again. Emily, meanwhile, kept trying to reach out. She'd text, call, leave voicemail saying she couldn't believe it was over, and asking for one more chance to explain. She claimed she'd made a mistake, and that she'd do anything to make it right. But I knew the truth. I'd given her every chance to come clean, every opportunity to be honest, and she'd chosen to lie until the evidence was undeniable. There was no going back. My friends and family started reaching out once they heard what was happening. Some were shocked, others angry on my behalf, but most of them were supportive. They told me that I was doing the right thing, that I deserved someone who wouldn't betray me. Their words gave me a sense of validation, something I hadn't realized I needed until I heard it. I'd been so wrapped up in the betrayal, in the disbelief, that I hadn't even thought about what I truly deserved. In the evenings, I'd sit in my nearly empty apartment and think about how much had changed so quickly. I was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained, but in a strange way, I also felt free. The constant doubt, the sneaking suspicion, the sleepless nights, all of that was gone. I could finally breathe again, even if it was through the ache of knowing I was moving on from a life I'd never expected to lose. A few days later, I received a message from Emily, more composed this time. She told me she was ready to accept my decision, but that she wanted to meet one last time, just to have some closure. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to see her again. But part of me also knew that this was a chance to put an end to it all, to walk away with my head held high and leave nothing unsaid. I agreed to meet her, figuring it would be our last conversation. We decided to meet at a small cafe we used to go to, a place that had once been filled with happy memories. But as I walked in and saw her sitting there, It didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like business, cold, formal, final. She looked up at me with a mixture of sadness and something else I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, but also a strange defiance. She started off by saying she was sorry, that she never meant to hurt me, that everything had just spiraled out of control. She insisted that the affair had been a distraction, and tried to explain how she'd felt neglected or lost, as if somehow that justified everything. I listened, but her words felt empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was more upset about getting caught than about what she'd done. Every excuse she made only strengthened my resolve. I calmly told her that I had been there, that I had been present and committed to our marriage, and that whatever she was looking for, she could have come to me. She didn't have an answer for that. She just looked down, fidgeting with her coffee cup. Then she tried a different tactic. She brought up our history, our memories, the good years we'd shared. She asked if I was willing to throw all of that away, as if one final plea could erase everything she'd done. She seemed to think that reminding me of the life we'd built would somehow make me forget the betrayal. But all it did was remind me of how much I'd lost, of the life I'd been willing to fight for, the future I'd wanted with her. When I told her I couldn't do this anymore, that I was done, I could see her mask slipping. The sadness turned into anger, and suddenly, she was blaming me all over again, saying I'd changed, and that I hadn't been the man she needed. I could see it now, so clearly. The same person who'd lied to me, who'd hidden behind sweet words while doing something so destructive. In that moment, I realized how little I truly knew this version of her. I stood up, not wanting to hear another word. I told her that whatever story she wanted to tell herself was her own, that I had no interest in her justifications. I didn't need them. I left her sitting there, stunned and silent, her final attempt to reel me back in shattered. Walking away from that cafe, I felt an odd mixture of relief and finality. It was like I'd finally closed the door on a chapter that had been dragging me down, weighing on me with every unanswered question, every betrayal. I knew this was truly the end, and as much as it hurt, I also felt a strange sense of liberation. I was free from the lies, from the constant doubt, and most of all, from the version of her that I'd once trusted with my whole heart. Over the next few weeks, I focused on building a new routine. I threw myself into work, reconnecting with friends, and even getting back into some hobbies I'd left behind. The emptiness of my apartment, the quiet I used to dread, was starting to feel like peace. There were no whispered phone calls to overhear, no late nights to question. Just me, alone with my thoughts. And, surprisingly, that wasn't as painful as I'd expected. Emily's messages came less and less frequently. She seemed to realize that there was no reversing what she'd done, and the apologies eventually stopped. She moved out of our home, into a small apartment across town, and we agreed to only communicate when necessary about the divorce proceedings. Our lives, once so closely intertwined, were now like two separate paths that barely touched. It was jarring, realizing how quickly someone you once loved deeply could become just a distant memory. I noticed, though, that people around me had their own opinions about what had happened. Some friends reached out, offering words of support, while others kept their distance, maybe unsure of what to say. My family was shocked, but they rallied around me, making it clear that I wasn't alone. I'd underestimated how much I needed that support, to be reminded that I hadn't lost everything, even if it felt like it. Then, one day, a close friend pulled me aside and suggested that maybe I look into therapy. At first, I brushed it off, thinking I could handle this on my own. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I was carrying, how much of my hurt I hadn't fully processed. So, reluctantly, I made an appointment. The therapist was a calm, understanding presence, someone who didn't judge or offer quick fixes. She listened as I laid out the whole story, from the confession under anesthesia to the painful confrontation. For the first time, I was able to talk about everything without holding back, without feeling like I had to protect myself from judgment. And slowly, I started to see things more clearly, not just what Emily had done but what it meant for me moving forward. Talking it all through helped me let go of the resentment, the bitterness. I'd been carrying those feelings like weights, letting them define my days. But through therapy, I began to understand that while Emily's actions had hurt me, they didn't have to control the rest of my life. It was up to me to decide how much space I was willing to give her betrayal. And, for the first time, I started to see a future where that space was smaller and smaller. Therapy turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd ever made. It didn't change what happened, and it didn't magically erase the pain. But it helped me unpack everything I'd been through and allowed me to start rebuilding from the ground up. Each session felt like peeling back layers, uncovering emotions I hadn't even realized I was holding on to. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt, and the loss of trust, not only in Emily but, in a way, in myself. How could I have missed the signs? How could I have let myself love someone who was capable of this? I went through it all, piece by piece. My therapist helped me see that the betrayal wasn't just about Emily's actions. It was about how her actions had impacted my sense of self-worth, my belief in what I thought I deserved, and the parts of me that had ignored my gut instincts to preserve the illusion of a perfect marriage. There was guilt there, too. Guilt that I'd been so trusting, that I'd let myself get blindsided, that I'd failed to see the cracks beneath the surface. At first, I was hesitant to admit those feelings to anyone, let alone myself. But slowly, the more I confronted them, the more I realized that this wasn't about blame. It was about acceptance, about acknowledging what had happened and what I could learn from it. In a strange way, I began to see that, while I hadn't been able to control Emily's choices, I could control my response to them. I could choose to keep holding on to the bitterness and anger, or I could choose to let it go, to use it as a stepping stone toward something better, something real. In one of our sessions, my therapist asked me to think back to the person I was before I met Emily. The person I'd been before the marriage, before I'd built my life around someone who ended up betraying me. At first, that was hard. I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought of myself as a separate person, not defined by the relationship. But as I dug deeper, I started to remember the things I'd loved about my life back then. My curiosity, my love for travel, the small but meaningful ambitions I'd put on hold to focus on us. I decided it was time to reclaim those parts of myself. I signed up for a weekend hiking trip, something I'd always wanted to do but had put off because Emily had never been interested. The first hike was tough, physically and emotionally, but standing at the top of that mountain, looking out over the view, I felt a clarity and strength that had been missing for so long. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about her or what had happened. I was just there, present in the moment, taking in the beauty around me and realizing how much I'd missed out on while I was tangled up in a life that hadn't been real. The sense of freedom and independence was addictive. I started doing more things for myself, going to the movies alone, taking drives out of town, picking up old hobbies I'd long since let slip. Each step forward was a reminder that I was more than the pain I'd been carrying, that I was capable of moving forward. I found myself surrounded by small, unexpected moments of happiness. Laughing over drinks with friends, discovering a new favorite hiking trail, waking up without that ache in my chest. But there were still hard days, days when I'd be blindsided by a memory or see something that reminded me of our life together. Sometimes it felt like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But even in those moments, I could see progress. I was starting to understand that healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy, full of setbacks, but those setbacks didn't erase the progress I'd made. They were part of it. I think one of the biggest revelations was realizing that I didn't have to forgive Emily to move on. I could leave that chapter behind without erasing the hurt. I didn't need to pretend it hadn't happened or offer some false sense of closure. My closure was simply in the act of letting her go, of allowing myself to walk away without bitterness or regret. It was freeing to know that I could take ownership of my own healing without needing anything from her. As the weeks turned into months, I felt myself truly embracing this new phase of my life. I'd been through the worst, and I'd survived. The pain had shaped me, yes, but it hadn't broken me. And somewhere along the way, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope for a future that was mine, a future that wasn't defined by betrayal or loss, but by the strength I'd found within myself. One day, as I was putting away the last of the boxes from our old life, I found an old photo album. Pictures of us from our first years together, trips we'd taken, moments I'd once cherished. I sat down and flipped through them, feeling a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Those moments had been real, in their own way, but they were part of a past that no longer defined me. I closed the album, placed it back in the box, and sealed it up, ready to let it go. As I settled into this new life, I noticed how much lighter I felt without constantly carrying around the weight of betrayal. The changes were subtle at first. I started sleeping better, waking up without that familiar ache in my chest. I found myself genuinely laughing again, actually enjoying conversations with friends and family without the underlying bitterness I'd once felt. It was as if I'd finally made room for myself in my own life again. With time, I realized I'd also let go of the questions that had haunted me. The whys and hows. Why did she cheat? How could she betray me after everything? For months, those questions had tormented me, echoing in my mind, dragging me back to painful memories. But now, I felt strangely at peace with the fact that some things would never have answers. Emily's actions were her choices, her mistakes to bear, and they didn't need to define me anymore. That realization was a turning point. I was no longer focused on what I'd lost, but on what I could rebuild. Slowly, I started reconnecting with people I'd drifted away from over the years. Friends I'd barely seen during my marriage, people I'd stopped reaching out to because I'd been too caught up in my own world. They welcomed me back with open arms, no questions asked, and it felt incredible to feel that sense of belonging again. One evening, a close friend suggested we take a trip. Just a weekend getaway, something to celebrate me moving forward. It felt impulsive, but I agreed. I realized that I needed this, a break from everything, a chance to let loose and enjoy life in a way I hadn't in years. We went up to a quiet little cabin in the mountains, surrounded by forests and far away from anything familiar. At night, we'd sit around a fire, talking about everything and nothing, laughing about old memories, and making new ones. For those few days, I forgot about Emily entirely. It was just me, my friends, and the pure, simple joy of being alive. On the last night, as I sat outside watching the stars, I felt this deep, undeniable sense of peace. It was as if the whole journey, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the painful process of rebuilding, had led me to this moment, to this place. I knew then that I didn't need anyone else's validation or love to be whole. I was enough on my own. And that realization filled me with a kind of strength I hadn't known before. Coming back from that trip felt like stepping into a new chapter. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't haunted by the past or worried about the future. I was content, grounded in the present, grateful for the life I was starting to create for myself. I made a promise to keep pursuing this feeling, to keep building a life that felt authentic and meaningful. And slowly, without even realizing it, I began to forgive myself for trusting, for loving, for staying as long as I did. I realized that those weren't weaknesses but strengths. They were reminders that I was capable of love and loyalty, and that one day, maybe, I'd find someone who was truly worthy of that part of me. But even if that day never came, I knew I'd be okay. I'd finally learned to live for myself, to find joy and meaning within, without needing anyone else to complete the picture. That was the biggest victory of all. After that trip, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was as if I'd finally shed the last remnants of the old life, leaving behind the pieces of myself that had been shattered. Each day, I became more certain of who I was and what I wanted. For the first time, I wasn't living for someone else's approval, wasn't bending myself to fit into someone else's vision. I was living for me. I poured my energy into work, throwing myself into projects that had always interested me but that I'd held back on pursuing. My colleagues noticed, complimenting me on my focus, my drive. Even my boss pulled me aside one day to comment on how I seemed like a new man. I didn't tell him what I'd been through, but I think he could sense that something profound had changed in me. Outside of work, I began exploring new hobbies and old passions that I'd once let slip away. I got back into photography, something I'd loved in my 20s. There was something therapeutic about capturing the world through a lens, finding beauty in the small things, in fleeting moments. I'd spend weekends wandering through parks, exploring little streets, and photographing whatever caught my eye. Each photo felt like a piece of my own story, something I was building for myself, by myself. Alongside photography, I picked up running. I started with short distances, barely able to keep a steady pace, but with time, I built up my endurance. Running became a release, a way to clear my head, to let go of any lingering frustration or anger that surfaced now and then. There was something freeing about the rhythm, the simplicity of putting one foot in front of the other. It was just me, the open path, and the quiet strength I was slowly reclaiming. As the weeks turned into months, I found that my thoughts of Emily grew less frequent. When they did surface, they were softer, gentler, not the sharp, painful memories they'd once been. She was becoming just another part of my past, like an old chapter in a book I'd read long ago. It felt strange to realize how little I felt about her now. I didn't hate her. I didn't even feel angry. Instead, I felt a kind of distant sympathy, hoping she, too, had found some way to move on. One evening, while sorting through a drawer, I stumbled upon a small stack of old photos of us. I paused, looking at our faces, smiling, carefree, caught in moments that had once felt like everything. I was surprised to find that I didn't feel much of anything beyond a quiet acknowledgement of those memories. They had been real, yes, but they belonged to a version of myself that I no longer was. Instead of feeling the need to keep them or destroy them, I simply set them aside in a box. They were just moments, remnants of a life that had served its purpose, and now it was time to let them rest. A few weeks later, I met up with some old friends I hadn't seen in years. They were surprised to see me back in town, and as we caught up over a few beers, they kept remarking on how different I seemed. One friend mentioned how I looked lighter, happier, and I realized that they were right. I was happier. I was more myself than I'd been in a long time. They asked if I was seeing anyone, and I laughed, realizing how little that mattered to me right now. For once, I didn't feel a need to rush into something or prove anything. I'd learned that I was whole on my own, and if I did ever decide to start a relationship again, it would be on my terms, without sacrificing myself in the process. As I walked home that night, I felt a sense of quiet pride. I'd survived the kind of heartbreak that could have broken me. I'd rebuilt my life, rediscovered my passions, and redefined what happiness meant to me. And I knew that, whatever the future held, I'd be ready for it. Life continued to unfold in ways I hadn't expected, as if each step forward revealed something new about who I was and who I could become. With each passing day, the wounds left by Emily's betrayal felt like they were finally healing over, no longer defining my life or my thoughts. I had reached a place where I wasn't running from the past anymore. I was simply living in the present, welcoming whatever came my way. One day, I received a message from an old college friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. She was passing through town and wanted to catch up. I was hesitant at first, wondering if meeting up would pull me back into memories I'd moved past. But something told me that this was different, that I was different, and that it was time to embrace the possibility of reconnecting with people without feeling weighed down by what had happened. We met for coffee at a small cafe downtown. As soon as I walked in, I felt an instant comfort seeing her. She hadn't changed much, still with that warm smile and easy laughter. We fell into conversation as though no time had passed, talking about everything from our careers to old memories, to the people we'd lost touch with. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to put on a brave face or explain my past. I was just me, and she was just someone I enjoyed spending time with. As the coffee date stretched into an afternoon walk, I realized how much I'd missed having this kind of connection. Easy, real, unforced. She asked about my life, and for once, I didn't feel the need to hide what I'd been through. I told her in a simple, straightforward way about my marriage, the betrayal, the painful path I'd taken to rebuild myself. She listened, no judgment, no pity, just understanding. It was refreshing. At one point, she looked at me and said that it was clear I'd found myself again, that there was a calm strength in me now that hadn't been there before. Hearing her say that meant more than I could explain. It felt like confirmation that the journey I'd been on, as difficult as it had been, had led me exactly where I was meant to be. As the sun began to set, we said our goodbyes with a promise to stay in touch. It wasn't a romantic spark, but rather a reminder of how meaningful it was to connect with others in a way that was genuine and true. That night, I lay in bed reflecting on how far I'd come. I realized that this journey had given me more than just a new perspective. It had given me a sense of confidence and peace I'd never known before. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into a steady rhythm. I continued my hobbies, kept in touch with friends, and in a quiet way, felt truly happy. I was living for myself, and I finally understood that happiness wasn't tied to another person. It was something I could find within, something I could build from the small, meaningful moments of each day. Then, one Saturday, while out on a morning run, I found myself pausing to watch the sunrise over the lake. The colors were brilliant, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, reflecting off the water. In that moment, I felt a sense of gratitude that was almost overwhelming, for the strength to keep going, for the people who had been there for me, for the chance to start fresh. I thought back to the person I'd been at the beginning of this journey, broken and unsure, weighed down by betrayal. And here I was now, standing on the edge of a beautiful new life, no longer haunted by the past. The future was open, full of possibility, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace it without looking back. In that quiet, peaceful moment, I knew I was finally free. As the months passed, I found myself embracing each day with a new perspective, one that felt calm, steady, and free from the shadows of the past. Life had become simpler and yet fuller, with small moments of happiness I might have once overlooked. I'd built something solid, something that belonged to me alone. One afternoon, I was going through my things, clearing out old papers, when I came across the last box that held the remnants of my life with Emily. Inside were items I'd put away months ago, wedding photos, keepsakes from trips, little mementos that had once meant everything. This time, as I looked through them, I didn't feel the pang of betrayal or loss. Instead, I felt a strange kind of peace, a quiet acceptance of what those memories had once been. With a deep breath, I closed the box. I decided to donate most of it, letting go of the physical reminders of a life that no longer held meaning for me. As I placed the box by the door, ready to take it to the donation center, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I'd finally released the last ties holding me to that past. That evening, I made a quiet toast to myself. It was a small gesture, just a glass of whiskey in the living room, but it felt significant. I toasted to resilience, to self-discovery, and to the unexpected journey I'd taken to find myself. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life I'd come to value deeply, one that had taught me strength, patience, and the ability to rebuild. Over time, I found myself more open to new experiences. I met new people, reconnected with old friends, and even started dating again, slowly, carefully. I didn't rush it. There was no desperation or fear of being alone, just a curiosity about what lay ahead. I knew now that I was whole on my own, and that was all the foundation I needed. In the end, this experience had given me more than it had taken. I'd learned that true happiness doesn't come from someone else. It's something you create, piece by piece, in the way you live, the choices you make, and the peace you find within yourself. Betrayal had shattered me, yes, but I had rebuilt myself, stronger and wiser than before. As I stood by the window that night, looking out at the quiet street below, I felt a deep, unshakable contentment. My life was my own, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for whatever came next. I had come full circle, finding strength in solitude and purpose in moving forward. And with that, I closed the chapter, not with anger, not with sadness, but with gratitude for the journey that had led me home to myself.